A strategy is an integrated set of choices that position you to succeed in a certain environment. Our job as strategists is to distill those insights down in the simplest fashion possible and then communicating that to folk in the organization and making their lives easier.
Can the top team, the people at the top, articulate the same strategy in the same way? If they cannot, you probably don't have a coherent strategy or a strategy at all. Welcome to Science of Leadership, where we explore leadership both practically and scientifically. What makes great leadership? Why these things matter, and how we can do them well. Those are the questions we wrestle with through thoughtful discussions and real-world stories. I'm Tom Collins, and as always, thanks for spending time with us as we explore what truly drives great leadership. Today, we're tackling one of the most misused and frankly abused words in organizational life: strategy. It's become something of an incantation. People say our strategy is when they're really talking about tactics, goals, or even just wishful thinking. To help us cut through the noise, I'm joined by someone who has spent his career helping organizations build real strategy and execute it well. Richard Benson-Armer, currently a senior advisor at Activant Capital and former senior partner at McKinsey, who also held chief strategy officer roles at the Thomson Corporation, now Thomson Reuters, and South African Breweries Beer Division, now part of AB InBev. Richard has worked with CEOs and leadership teams across the globe, helping companies navigate complexity and actually do strategy, not just talk about it. Richard, thanks for joining me today on the Science of Leadership.
It's such a pleasure to be with you today to chat about a subject that's near and dear to my heart.
Let's start by getting really clear on this. When leaders use the word strategy, what do they commonly get wrong? What is strategy not?
Strategy is not exactly as you articulated up front, some wishful thinking. It's not a specific goal. Strategy is not to become the number one in the world or to grow my market share to 30%. It's also not a very detailed plan or a budget. A strategy is much more than that. Tom, to me, a strategy is an integrated set of choices that position you to succeed in a certain environment. Essentially, what it should be doing is building on those competences, the capabilities, the assets that you have that uniquely position you in that market. And it includes very clear trade-offs, things you will do, but importantly, things that you won't do.
Yeah, that's helpful. That it's a conscious decision of clear actions and inactions, things you will and won't do, that really you're focused on to put you in a certain position within your landscape, whether it's a market, whether it's in healthcare, a university setting, in the military, whatever it may be, governmental. I've spent a lot of time studying strategy, both formally in graduate school courses, but also reading books in my own time. And there's this book you may have read by Richard Rummelt, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. He's an emeritus professor at UCLA, and he's written extensively on strategy, as I'm sure you know, but he defined real strategy as being comprised of three things. The first was diagnosis of the problem. So what are you trying to overcome? The second was a guiding policy, which is this overarching policy or method for overcoming that problem. And number three, coherent actions. So a set of coordinated, integrated steps that work together to carry out that guided policy.
Love it. When I was at McKinsey, Tom, we used to just obsess about three steps and honestly just different words for the same thing. Number one, we used to obsess about understanding the environment, very specifically, where did our clients compete and where were they operating, in which particular parts of a market, geographic or value segments of a market. Secondly, we really wanted to understand how markets had evolved and where they might evolve over time. And we spent a lot of time worrying about profit pools because profit pools are where the money are. And you want to make sure that you're focused on those large opportunities. And then we wanted to very honestly hold a mirror up to our clients and critically assess what their competences were, what were they good at, and where were others perhaps better positioned. So that was number one, understanding the environment. Number two, we would really worry about defining where to compete. Which particular part of the market did you want to go after? And thirdly, specifying how to win. So understand the environment, define where to compete, and specify how to win. That's how we approached it. So, as I said, slightly different words to Professor Rumelt, but same basic concept.
Yeah, and that that gets so much at what we're talking about here with what strategy really is. It's this it's a conceptual framework of how you're going to approach this problem, this singular problem that you're going to overcome and how you're going to do it. Thanks for expanding on Ronald's work there. Just a bit ago, you had brought in a vital part uh, to this conversation. You talked about things that strategy isn't, and you included things like it's not a high level vision or mission kind of statement thing. It's not a specific goal or aspiration. We're going to, be number one in the world, or it's it's not even necessarily a budget, a roadmap, or things like that. Also, it's not a list of unrelated things. There are a couple of things also that I was thinking about to add to that list. If I could tack those on, it's a little bit funny on one hand, and then it's sad on the other. But the one of the ones that I would add is it's not fluffy motivational slogans or buzzwords. There's so much about that. Like, I feel like, I mean, I know a lot of people in C-suites and things, and they're all well-intentioned and bright people. And I feel like either in the books that they're reading, or maybe if they've done an MBA or something of that nature, there's some course out there, some training they get that says just stick strategic in front of any word, and it'll make you seem like you know what you're talking about. Strategic planning, strategic budgeting, strategic thinking, strategic this, that. And so it's just this buzzword that really doesn't mean anything. And so it's not, strategy is not that. And then, probably most importantly, I think, strategy isn't an attempt to do everything. Real strategy involves choosing what not to do.
Well, that's such a key point. Businesses, just like people, have finite resources, be that money, time, the ability to focus on certain things. And if you're not making those deliberate choices, those trade offs between what you will do and what you won't do, honestly, the chances of success are significantly limited. We have to be very careful. I think the choice about deciding what not to do also links into the ability to move in a new direction. Organizations, just like people, are very resistant to change. And quite often, strategies will come in and challenge the status quo. They'll challenge the power base in an organization. None of us like change. None of us like losing power. So the question becomes, how do we deliberately say we're not going to do it without alienating the organization? And I think part of that is, things like systems and processes to support it. But your point around, what we will do, what we won't do, absolutely key for success, implementing strategy at the end of the day. And honestly, in formulating and deciding what you won't do is a key step.
You're just hitting on something there that I think is so vital, this idea of buy-in, right? When people introduce strategy that is a change to the status quo, it pushes people outside of their comfort zone. And what is it? Something like 70% of change initiatives fail, right? And I think that the biggest reason for that probably is that they didn't get the buy-in that they needed to make it
Yeah.
successful. Probably second to that is they didn't actually have a good plan to make it happen. But this concept of buy-in is a part of that to such a critical degree. And so I appreciate you bringing that point up.
There's one thing that I would do that might be helpful to folk listening in is, we often used to talk about solving the problem and solving for impact. Solving the problem is an intellectual exercise, and you can go through it and you can run the numbers and you can figure out where you want to go, and it's very logical in many ways, creative but logical nonetheless, built off a solid fact base. And then solving for impact was all around, okay, fantastic, I've got this. Now, how do I make it real? What is it that I need to do to deliver the impact at the end of the day, align the organization, what systems, what processes, am I shifting the budget in the right places, things like that. So love what you're hitting on. And again, solve the problem and solve for impact. To me, two separate things, but completely related in the development of a single successful strategy.
Brilliant. I like that. I'll have to remember that one. Let me pause here for a second and remind our listeners that my book, The 4 Stars of Leadership, is now available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and essentially all online outlets. It's getting rave reviews, and I'm certain you will find it not only informative, but also inspiring. So I hope you'll order your copy today. Now let's get back to this interesting conversation. Well, In a storied career like yours, I'm sure you have thousands of examples and stories that you could use of what real strategy looks like. But could you share one that really encapsulates it for us?
Yeah, one, that's tough. Let me give you a couple as we go
Couple's
through,
fine,
Tom,
yeah.
and pick those out. And a couple of stories that I really like because it does talk about the elements of strategy and the articulation and the deliberate shifting to a new way of working. So the first example comes out of the Thomson Corporation, the pivot from newspapers into digital media over time. Dick Harrington, someone I respect and trust tremendously, was the CEO of the Thomson Corporation. At that point, the world's largest operator, very profitable operator of regional and local newspapers. And in the late 90s, Dick was looking at the landscape, sitting on top of this pile of cash in this machine that just kept throwing out profits time after time. And he looked at the rise of the internet and digital media, and he looked at the rise of the knowledge worker. And those two things are completely related in many ways. And Dick came to the conclusion that print-based, consumer-focused media through newspapers was not the way to win in the future. And he went to the board and put forward a very bold proposal, which was to focus going forward on knowledge workers and to focus on B2B media, not B2C, because business to business media was more profitable than business to consumer, and focus on knowledge workers. And he compellingly laid out for the board the case for change. And within a space of weeks, the company pivoted. They landed up selling 54 daily newspapers, 75 community based newspapers in the space of less than a year, and shifted into B2B information services. And Tom, I was fortunate enough to be chief strategy officer at the Thomson Corporation for a number of years and worked very closely with Dick and the team on a host of things. But driving this shift from print to digital was a core part of what we did. Focusing on knowledge workers, doctors, lawyers, investment bankers, scientists, and giving them the tools that they needed to do their jobs. We used to obsess about workflow and what does someone do 2 minutes before they touch our product and 2 minutes after. And we would just expand. And, Thomson grew to be the largest information services provider in the world from a relatively modest background. So I thought that was a terrific example where Dick took stock of the industry, where things were, deliberately made a set of changes, and they got rid of things they didn't want to do, even though they were very profitable. So nice example. Second one, and it's probably fine to share this now because the strategy has run its course, is the global roll-up in the brewing industry. And beer for the longest time was a very local business. The product went off. Yes, pasteurization and refrigeration changed that, but it was a regional business as recently as the 1990s. Heineken might claim to be, a global brewer, but essentially they were a collection of multi-local businesses that operated. Little Belgian brewer, a company by the name of Interbrew, had fantastic global aspirations, and they stepped outside of Belgium. They made an acquisition of Labatt Breweries of Canada. And the combination of Labatt and Interbrew, called Interbrew in those days, had the princely total of 2% of the global market. And Tom, they were number 4 in the world. So, unbelievably fragmented industry. And back in 97, they sat down and did a set of analysis around the industry, the economics, where things were and how they might evolve. And they came through with 3, I think, very important observations. Number 1, the industry was premiumizing. It was all shifting to the high end, and obviously premium products have much higher margins. So, if you're making twice the amount of money in a particular segment, it's twice as attractive than other segments. So premiumization was number 1. Number 2 was that the microeconomics really impacted the profitability in the industry, and economies of scale were real. And number 3, importantly, you could afford to overpay for an acquisition initially, as long as you kept doing deals to build upon that platform and expand it and grow it. And little Interbrew, with 2% of the global market in 1997, is today a company known as AB InBev that has 25% share of the global market from a volume perspective and a much higher share than that from a profit perspective. So insights, understanding of where you're at, very deliberate actions, and they moved forward and created what I think is a fantastic company as a result of that. So 2 examples instead of 1, Tom.
2 tremendous examples, both just when you talk about Thomson and basically selling off what they did. Like, this is what we do. We're gonna in 1 year's time, we're going to sell all that off and go in a completely different direction. That was a gigantic gamble, prescient in so many ways, fascinating. And then to go from a little known sort of local, if you will, uh, company to being a quarter of the world's beer. I imagine that's a lot of beer.
So yeah,
So
it's a lot of money. And the last time I looked, they had a market capitalization of 175 billion. I don't know what it is today, but when Interbrew was thinking about these things, the market cap was 5 billion. So tremendous value creation for a lot of people along the way. And I would argue we all win. As consumers, we win because we are able to get access to better products at more affordable prices. Company wins, shareholders win. Great story.
yeah, thanks for sharing those. So let's shift into the so what of our conversation. Why is strategy important, and why does it matter that leaders distinguish between real strategy, what we're talking about, and this other stuff that we have hit on that is passed off as strategy?
I think there's a couple of things. Number one, it focuses us. There is a very clear objective to a strategy. Secondly, it forces us to make deliberate trade offs, back to the point about resources being finite and actually deciding what it is we will do and what we won't do, and then aligning the organization behind it. And if you have a common story with those objectives, you can align an organization. I've heard people often talk about the difference between a winning strategy and an unsuccessful strategy is trying hard and trying to win deliberately. And to me, it's that trying hard is not a strategy. Trying hard is something that we do, but deliberately winning is what we want out of a strategy. And I think it comes down to that. Let's deliberately win. Let's not try hard along the way.
Sure. I was thinking about, I mean, you'll appreciate this as a South African, right? But was rugby. You can try hard. That's what you do maybe in on a play, right? If you're looking to win the championship, that won't get you far. You have to win deliberately. You have to have things that you're doing step by step to get to that accomplishment. And anyway, that came to mind while you were talking. Then the other thing that came to mind, that was you can tell a lot about the state of an organization, specifically with regard to strategy, with what they are willing to say no to. I think that's so informative with regards to where organizations are.
Make total sense like that. I just concur. Support it completely.
You gave us a couple of great examples for what strategy looks like. Do you have a good story that shows where having that clear, articulated strategy and implementing it effectively made the difference for an organization?
Well, I'll give you one that I think is very interesting because it provides a complement to what the business did and built off a lot of the assets that they had in place. And I'm talking very specifically here about the Loblaw companies in Canada. And Loblaw is Canada's largest grocer, and they have an iconic brand, President's Choice. And President's Choice is so trusted by Canadians that it's ranked right up there with Coke and other iconic global brands. It's unbelievable asset that they have. They also recognized that they had another asset besides just this brand and the trust that consumers had in them. They were a place that people went typically 2 or 3 times a week. And that's interesting. And if you think about the combination of a trusted brand and a presence that they were able to leverage, the Loblaw companies decided to launch in Canada something called President's Choice Financial. And it was a little bit of a unique twist on banking. Now, they knew that the brand President's Choice was more trusted than banks. They also knew that customers valued value or appreciated value, and they decided to launch the first no-fee banking offer in Canada. And they partnered with a bank to actually be the back end of the process. They were the front end. And what they did was I think, quite unique and unbelievably successful. They ran through the pilots, but they were able to recruit into this new bank, President's Choice Financial, 1.5 million customers in 2 years. Now, if you think at that point in history, Canada had 25 million adults, 11.5 million households. We're talking about 1.5 million customers. 6% of all adults embraced this offer within a short period of time, 2 years. What was super interesting, what was even more insightful, and they didn't share this when they went after the strategy or the proposition, They were able, because they had a loyalty program that linked the shopper basket data with the demographics and the characteristics of the individual, they were able to understand what you bought, what I bought, and who we were as human beings. And as a marketer, the ability to identify what people spend money on and market them directly is incredible value. So they created something quite unique, but leveraging off the assets that they had. And this was a deliberate decision to do something new. They didn't stop doing anything, but they did do additional items that built off that strength and created a fantastic business that reinforced the proposition of what they were about: trust and value for Canadian shoppers.
That's a great example. And one thing that I don't want our listeners to miss is the word asset. Use that multiple times. And the asset in strategy, in real strategy readings, and when people, Rummelt and others, talk about strategy, that's what they're talking about, is this: what is your key strength? And that's what, and when you use asset, that's what you're talking about. People valued president's choice. They saw that as something they could trust, right? Fundamentally, it was about trust, the trust the people had in president's choice, and that was an asset to the company to be able to move forward and achieve this thing. So, tremendous example for us. Thinking about what we're talking about here in the story that you just shared, I think science really backs up what we're discussing. There are three consistent findings that we see in the scientific literature on strategy, formation, and execution. The first is strategy is fundamentally about choice and differentiation. Michael Porter's seminal work shows that strategy requires choosing a unique position and building a configuration of activities that fit together and reinforce that position. To clarify that, it means the unique position is the organization's specific capabilities that set it apart and can be leveraged to overcome the problem. When organizations fail to identify their unique position and don't leverage it, they aren't engaging in strategy and they erode performance. Number two, organizational alignment is a primary driver of execution success. So, research by Kaplan and Norton demonstrates that companies with clear strategic alignment across their systems, processes, and workforce execute more effectively and outperform peers. When the entire organization understands the strategy, performance actually improves significantly. And number three, coherent strategic action builds resilience and adaptability. Eisenhart and Saul found that simple, coherent strategic rules enable organizations to adapt faster in uncertain environments. Clarity, not complexity, drives agility. So those are some, key points from the scientific literature that supports what we're talking about here.
You're quoting the strategy gods. When that work came out, late 80s in the case of Porter's work, early 90s in the case of Norton and Kaplan, as relevant today as it was back then. Just foundational work. And, as folk have listened to us talk, the same core principles apply today. And, we still use them actively as we go through strategy. We should probably dwell on that point for a moment. Norton Kaplan's work around aligning the business, the organization around the achievement of the strategy. We spoke a little earlier about solving the problem, solving for impact. So key. There is the old adage, and you've heard this a million times, I'm sure, that, culture eats strategy for lunch. Yeah, that's true, but that's only because you're not solving the second part of the question. So solve the problem, the strategy, solve for impact, the cultural part, and make sure that all the systems are working in the same direction. And I do love the work that Eisenhart did on strategy under uncertainty as it goes through, because what she's doing there very simply is she's creating heuristics, little rules for people in the organization to make those trade-off decisions between what they will do and what they won't do. And love it. I think it's super important. And little aside, Tom, as we go through, quite familiar with that work. When I was at McKinsey up in Toronto, one of my colleagues there, Shona Brown, was collaborating with Kathleen on a lot of the work that they were doing at that point out of Stanford. And I was privileged enough to get a look at some of the early proofs, the chapter proofs of the book that they wrote, Competing on the Edge, Strategy is Structured Chaos. And lovely to see this work still, as relevant today as it was way back then in the 90s when I was reading those proofs.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that says something about you with your expertise and and how you're regarded that you got an opportunity to see those ahead of time.
You're being very kind. I'm not sure that's the case at all, but
Well, there's one other thing that I was thinking about, I probably should throw in here, with regard to healthcare leadership research, side of things. It's been shown that a lack of strategic clarity actually increases burnout. So my friend and colleague Tate Shanafelt, who was actually a guest on the podcast previously, has shown that when people don't know what matters, they feel overwhelmed and get inundated by competing priorities and suffer from burnout and inability to know which direction they should be heading. So negative impacts from that side too.
Tom, that's a great insight and fantastic example. Something I honestly hadn't thought about, but reflecting on it, I think it's absolutely right. And our job as strategists is to distill those insights down in the simplest fashion possible, and then communicating that to folk in the organization and making their lives easier. The most insightful and brilliant strategies are often the easiest to explain because the hard work has gotten through to figuring out what it is you need to do. And look, the reality is most people don't like ambiguity. So the more certainty we can give them, the better off they are. So love that example, and it's a terrific insight.
Well, Richard, let's turn to the practical side of this conversation now. A leader listening today might say, "Okay, I want real strategy, but where do I begin?" What would you say?
Well, I'd say, first of all, strategy is a process, and anyone can do it. Now, it's something that is not magic, but what it is often quite hard work. First of all, build that solid fact base about the environment that you're operating in, and just make sure that it's there. Then distilling the insights, being honest with yourself about what advantages that you have, and then defining where to play and how to compete. And the more thorough you are, the easier this becomes. But perhaps a moment, Tom, when you and I were chatting about the podcast, I loved the very simple list that you had of steps that folk could take. So perhaps a good time to share that list with listeners.
Yeah. So in thinking about this, for a practical method for creating an effective strategy, I've read, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy a couple times. And Rumel's other book is that I've read is called The Crux, which is another a good book on strategy that I would recommend. But I drew on his definition of strategy and some other readings. For instance, Henry Mintzberg's classic, The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning, which, to be honest, I would not necessarily recommend you read. It's a rather lengthy read and can be a slog. So just know that I have referenced it with regards to building what I'm about to say. Uh, but the kind of strategic thing that I came up with for practical tips was, one, determine what it is you are actually trying to do. What is the problem that you're trying to overcome? Understand that. Number two, understand your competitive landscape. Who is your competition? Where are things headed? The Thomson example you gave earlier, he was prescient to know where things were headed. There were probably people who thought he was insane, but he knew
Mhm.
where things were headed. Know where things are headed. Know what your landscape is. Number three, identify the unique capabilities or assets, as you described, your organization has and or can develop to overcome that problem you identified earlier. Those unique capabilities are the engine for your strategy. If you don't have them or don't leverage the ones you have, your strategy is going to fail. Number four, create a clear, articulable policy for employing your unique capabilities to attack the problem. Number five, I've got 7 of these. Number five, develop concrete, coherent actions to enact your policy. Number six, allocate the necessary resources that you need to make your policy effective. And number seven, communicate the strategy relentlessly. You cannot over communicate. The average employee needs to hear something multiple times in multiple formats to internalize it. So those are the seven things that I came up with.
Not much to add to that list, Tom. It's a terrific list. Just reinforcing a couple of those points. Number 6 and 7, you were talking very clearly, actually 5 and 6, I should say, very clearly about aligning the systems, the processes, and then putting the resources in place. Some terrific research that McKinsey did I find quite interesting, and this is on large corporations. But what they found was that simply shifting 5% of a budget was enough to differentiate the winners from the losers, so to speak, in strategy. So it's a case of putting sufficient resources there, but it's not throwing out everything that you've done before. It's really just shifting direction slightly, and 5% was the number they came up with, and terrific research. Let me add one, though, for all of our listeners along the way, and that is really building the mechanisms in to monitor progress over time so that you can adapt. The reality is we live in a complex world. Things change all the time. Competitors take actions we might not have anticipated. Regulators pass laws that we might not have thought about beforehand. New technologies come out that we perhaps didn't know about. And it's really important to learn to adapt over time. And here we're talking about refinements to a strategy as opposed to a complete wreck and rebuild. Wreck and rebuild may be appropriate if there's sufficient change, but most times it's just a refinement. And if you have a strategy, typically they endure for 3 to 5 years if you've got this right. This is not something that's short term. 3 to 5 years, I think, is pretty typical. And the belief that you're going to go in a straight line between A and B over a 5-year period, that is not going to happen. So build in the ability to adapt as time goes along.
Those are tremendously helpful insights, Richard. And you just hit on something. I've just started working on a paper on nonlinearity of successful careers, and that you just hit a button when you were talking about that this idea that it's just going to be this straight linear thing is not really not reality. So anyway, that brought that to mind. Another thing that I was thinking about as I was preparing for our conversation and thinking in general about strategy, about a method that a person, a group, an organization, whatever it might be, could use to identify if they actually have a real strategy. And so in trying to do that, I came up with 3 questions that I think create a test of sorts. So the first is, can the top team, the people at the top, articulate the same strategy in the same way? If they cannot, you probably don't have a coherent strategy or a strategy at all. Number 2, are resources, that's time, talent, capital, you mentioned that, allocated in a way that reflects a small number of directional choices. Directional choices in this regard is getting back to this idea of what is an organization, willing to invest in versus not. And the third, it's tied to that, is the organization saying no to good ideas because they're not part of the strategy? If the answer is no to any of those, the organization doesn't really have a real strategy.
Those are 3 terrific questions. Do we have alignment? Have we committed sufficient resources? And are we actively taking decisions to stop doing things to allow us to do new things? Terrific list, Tom.
Richard, I like to end episodes with one final question. And you've spent decades helping leaders build real strategy. What's the one piece of advice you want to leave every leader who's listening?
Strategy is not magic. It's often hard work, but it's unbelievably rewarding, and it's essential. And just as the woodsman has to stop to sharpen his axe to move forward more quickly and more efficiently, so too do you as a leader have to take the time to sharpen your strategy so that the organization can move forward more quickly and more efficiently. Strategy is not a choice. It's an imperative, and it's your responsibility as a leader to facilitate and lead the process to develop winning strategies.
Perfectly said. Richard, thank you for joining us on The Science of Leadership.
Tom, it was a pleasure and joy to be with you today.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.